Welcome to the fourth week in Apocalypse, the Revelation of Jesus and Interpretation. This week we're going to look specifically at the text from Revelation chapter 6 and the first few chapters of Revelation chapter 8. We're going to explore specifically the seven seals. But I want to talk about the seven trumpets and the seven bowls as well, and spend some time on the context of the letter as it impacts these sections in the book of Revelation, so you can begin to understand some of the imagery that's contained in it. And then I want to look specifically at the text from Revelation chapter 6 and the few verses in Revelation chapter 8. You'll notice that this week I'm skipping over Revelation chapter 7. That's because we're going to come back to it next week, and there's a very good reason we'll talk about toward the end here today. I want to open with some very basic comments about my way of reading and interpreting the Revelation. I have a more what's called poetic approach to the book. I think the Revelation expresses ultimate truths about the world from God's perspective. And I think the form of those truths is as a protest against the persecution, or as I've called it, the prosecutions, occur at the hands of the Roman state in Asia Minor. I don't think that the book of Revelation is necessarily written in code that requires you to interpret it. I think instead it contains a lot of references and images from the lived experiences of Christians. And those lived experiences and the references and images that are used are used in such a way so as to construct a text that speaks about what God wants us to learn from those lived experiences. In other words, I don't see the book of Revelation as depicting the end of the world. I think that's too simplistic a read. I think the book of Revelation is about the everyday experiences of Christians and the call that Christians have to stay faithful to God no matter what. No matter what we endure, no matter what the world throws at us, no matter what's taking place in the world, Christians are called to be faithful. And I think that's the central message of the book. I think the book intends to give us God's perspective on those experiences and help us to understand why faithfulness is the road to take. Admittedly, that's a different approach than what a lot of people have toward the book of Revelation. A lot of people will approach the book of Revelation as if it were what I consider to be a divine almanac. You know, you look up the signs and you know what to plant that particular season. I think that's the way a lot of people approach the book of Revelation, and I think it misses so much because it's not just about us and what may take place now. It's about what has taken place in the world from the moment the first Christians in Asia Minor expressed their faith in public. And I think it's still the experience of Christians in the world. I don't think much has changed from then to now, and I don't think much is going to change from now till whenever. we need to have God's view of world events and see why it is that God calls us to remain faithful, even in the most tumultuous, excruciating moments in world history. So when we come to these sections in the book of Revelation, particularly the seven seals, and the seven trumpets, and the seven bowls, a lot of people read these as if they're chronological. You got to go through one to get to the next. I don't think that's the case. In fact, I think they're kind of all one great big unit. And so when you look at one, you're kind of looking at them all, just with a different, I think, intensity. So we're only going to spend time with the seals. We're not going to spend time with the trumpets and bowls, but that's not because they're not important. It's just because when you read through them, after we've looked at the seals, you're going to see the kinds of things recurring again with a different intensity, but it's the same perspective. So what are we to make of these seals and trumpets and bowls? Just how dreadful are they? First off, it's important to notice that there are 7 series. There's 7 seals, there are 7 trumpets, and there are 7 bowls. And in the book of Revelation, in terms of its imagery, when you have the number 7, it intends completeness, the entirety. So 7 seals, we're going to look at those specifically. 7 trumpets in chapter 8, verse 6 through chapter 11, verse 19. And 7 bowls in chapter 15, verse 5 through chapter 16, verse 21. Every one of those series, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls, are all a way of using different colors on the same painting. So 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, all tell the same story. But in each series, things are getting progressively worse. The 7 trumpets are worse than the 7 seals, and the 7 bowls are worse than the 7 trumpets, but they tell the same story. They paint the same picture. And the message in all 3 is clear. So by the time we get done with the 7 seals this week, you'll be able to read through the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls, and it won't be as stunningly mysterious as people think. Things that happen in heaven when these seals are opened have effects on earth. The same is true for the trumpets. When the trumpets are blown in heaven, there is an effect had on earth. Same is true for the bowls. When the bowls are poured out, they're poured out in heaven, but the effects are felt on earth. What are those effects? Well, turns out they're the kinds of effects that we've come to know as human history. War, economic oppression or economic struggle, disease, and disaster. We think of these as the way history works. That's how we tell our history. We tell our history primarily by the battles that are fought and the generals that fought them. In terms of the economic downturns that happen, Black Friday was 1929. We know how to tell history through the lens of these events on earth. But what's God's perspective on these events? Now, we too easily like to focus in on the details in telling our history. It is, after all, how we tell our history. But what if God's perspective has the same message no matter what the details are? What if God's way of looking at war stays the same no matter which war it is? And what if God's message to Christians in the midst of war is the same no matter which war it is and how devastating it can be? I think it is that perspective that these seals want to paint. And in order to get that across, there's some Roman history that we need to know that we don't commonly associate with the New Testament. Because let's be honest, when it comes to the New Testament, Christians have a tendency of pulling that text out of history. We don't connect the larger events of world history with the text itself. So the kinds of things that I'm about to go over are things that you more than likely have already known in your high school world history class. But when you pin them on a map and you pin them in terms of their date, and then you look at the text, you're like, wow, how in the world did I ever miss this? So let's talk about the historical context. And in terms of historical context, I'm going to start with about 50 AD, and I'm going to go to about 100. So a 50-year time window. Now, to put that in New Testament context, we're dealing roughly with the period from about Acts chapter 15, to the ending of the writing of the book of Revelation. The majority of the New Testament, was written between 50 and 100 AD. So all of the events that we're about to talk about take place in the lives of Christians who are producing the text. The life of Paul took place within the context of a lot of these events. And I want to start with earthquakes. Earthquakes were quite common in the Mediterranean world, and they were particularly destructive. Beginning in about 60 AD, in Colossae and, notice the city, Pergamum, there was an earthquake. And this series of earthquakes over the next couple of 3 years were massive in the Mediterranean world. Colossae and Pergamum in 60, Achaia and Macedonia, that's Greece, in 61, Pompeii in 62, Naples, which is over in Italy, in 64, Corinth, which is on the eastern coast of Greece, in 69, Cyprus in 77, and the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was in AD 79. How many of you, when you read about earthquakes in the New Testament, associate Vesuvius with earthquakes? And I want you to think just how tragic and dramatic the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was, shooting ash hundreds of miles up and out, darkening the sun for periods of time, such that the Mediterranean world believed the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was the end of the world. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius created tidal waves, created earthquakes smaller earthquakes out from Pompeii. And Mount Vesuvius was so traumatic an event that the Roman world largely thought it was the end of the world. All of the apocalyptic imagery in the New Testament, particularly around earthquakes, has to do with the way in which these early Christians, as part of their Roman culture, absorbed what took place with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. If you pulled the average Christian in Smyrna off the street and said, I want you to tell me about earthquakes, they would start describing the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And they would speak in imagery that involves the end of the world. And the same is true for the average non-Christian on the Roman street in Smyrna. But more than that, the wars and social calamity that was happening in the Roman Empire from 50 AD to about 100 paint a really bleak picture of daily life for lived Romans in whatever section of the Roman Empire they were. And the first of these is the Parthian army's victory over what was considered to be the invincible Roman army in 62. How many of you knew that there actually was an empire that defeated Rome? And they were dreadfully feared, the Parthians. Just 2 years later, in Rome, the Great Fire of Rome, the one where Nero supposedly torched the city and went out on his deck and fiddled while Rome burned. The Great Fire of Rome. Well, the rumor started to circulate about Nero and how he was responsible for the fire. He wasn't, but he was, the allegation was he was responsible for the fire, and so he had to find somebody to pin it on. The easiest group to do this to was the Christians. So in 64 AD, when rumors start circulating that Nero's the reason that Rome burned in this massive fire, the Christians did it. And Nero's response to the Christian community is recorded by one Roman historian as being so outside what was acceptable Roman policy that even he protested. Now, I want you to hear that for a second. Nero was so vicious for Christians after this fire that a Roman historian who records Nero's life said he went overboard. What did Nero do to the Christians? He systematically rounded up Christians in Rome, would sew them inside the animal skin, the skins of dead animals, toss them in the arena for lions to rip apart. He would dip them in boiling oil, skewer Christians on a pole, put the pole on the side of the road, and light it as a torch to light the Roman road. That was the brutality of Nero. I want you to think about what that would do to the psyche of Christians. Because what does it do to you? To know that Christians were blamed for this great fire. They did nothing. They were not part of it. But yet, that's the response. Just a couple of years later, there is, partly in response to this growing concern about Christians and Jews, the Judean War between 66 and 70 AD in Palestine, recorded by a Jewish historian, Josephus, that results in the destruction, just complete destruction of the temple by General Titus. And this destruction was so thorough that when the temple was entirely torn down, Titus had his troops go behind them and sow salt on the ground so that nothing would ever grow back. When Matthew has on Jesus' lips the words, the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24, this is what he's talking about. This is how desolate the Jewish and Christian communities were left by Roman aggression. In the midst of that war, Nero commits suicide, which sparks a civil war among his generals. A civil war that spread to various corners of the Roman Empire. It's known as the Year of Four Emperors. "15 years later, 20 years later, 25 years later, there are massive crop failures throughout the Roman Empire as part of an ecological disaster that results in what's known as the Great Famine. And this Great Famine resulted in large-scale starvation and death in corners of the Roman Empire. This was the lived experience of people in the first century. Now, we have kind of an antiseptic notion of being Christian in the first century. It was anything but. There was nothing but war and destruction and death and famine. This is how these people lived. Just to give you some idea about the Parthian Empire and how threatening it was. I'm going to show you a map here. This is the Roman Empire compared to the Parthian Empire. And I want you to know where the Parthian Empire stretches toward. How far away is it from Ephesus, one of the cities mentioned in the book of Revelation? This imperial threat to the Roman army really isn't that far away. So for Christians in Asia Minor, how do they feel? How is their everyday life as a Christian in Asia Minor lived? In the constant fear of war, in the constant fear of famine, the constant fear of earthquakes, the constant fear of drought, the constant fear of death. In that lived experience, you're supposed to keep your eyes focused on Jesus. Little wonder that there were times in certain cities in Asia Minor that was hard to do. I'm not so sure I would have been one of the faithful ones. Thank God there were. I have my faith because they kept theirs. But in that lived experience, now that prayer, how long, makes an awful lot of sense. How long before God intervenes in a world so wrapped in cycles of violence and death and destruction and poverty? How long do we have to endure? And this is on our doorstep. So when you turn to the text, the first four seals in Revelation 6, 1 through 8, we commonly refer to them as the four horsemen. What they do is they revise some Old Testament imagery that's already in the Old Testament prophetic tradition. And in particular, there are four horses. There's a white horse, a red horse, a black horse, and a pale horse. The white horse has a rider with a crown who goes out to conquer and who will conquer the world. Clearly, that's a victorious imagery. So who would the rider of this white horse be? Now, a lot of people want to make this out to be a Parthian, the Parthian army, which it could well be, but I don't think so. Because in the book of Revelation, there is a rider on a white horse. And from the start of these four seals, I think the person to keep your eye on is not over on the outskirts of town about to knock on the door of the Roman Empire. I don't think you need to worry about that from God's perspective. When the first seal is opened, the one who comes out for you to see is Jesus. Constantly keep your eye on him. The white horse with the rider with the crown, that's a victorious imagery of Jesus. Then there comes a red horse. Rider on a red horse. Now this rider is based on the imagery war. Well, there's little wonder you'd worry about that. in the world around you, there's little wonder you'd worry about war. The black horse for famine, the pale horse for death and Hades. Little wonder you would worry about these, because this is your life. And not much has changed. How many times do I hear presidential candidates bloviate about World War III? And Christians so concerned at the prospect of civil war that they will hoard AR-15s at home. Not much has changed. The fifth seal is opened, and it is that the martyrs are crying out from under this altar, "How long?" The chopping block of the Roman executioner has, in the fifth seal, become the universe's altar. And think about that imagery from Romans 12. Present your life a living sacrifice. Not much has changed. The prayer that goes out from those who endure this excruciating suffering for their faith, how long? And then comes the response, endure with patience. Endure with patience. God is not done. The world can do horrible things to you, but remember what it did to Jesus. And what was God's response? Patiently endure, as He patiently endured. Then we come to the sixth seal, which goes from very specific persecution of Romans, the martyrdom of Roman Christians, to generalized suffering. And it's little wonder that this disaster imagery would be common in apocalyptic literature when you consider just how common this disaster mentality was in first century lives for everyday people. And there is no place to hide from this suffering. The kings of the earth, and the magnates, and the generals, and the rich, and the powerful, and everyone, slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling for the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne, from the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come. Who is able to stand? Once God finally intervenes, there's nowhere to hide, there's nothing you can do. And all the powerful, all the good Romans, no matter who they are, all the way down to slave and free, hide and say, just let the mountains fall down. Bring on the earthquakes. Let it happen. Because we can't stand upright, pious, good Romans in the face of the wrath of the Lamb. What does that wrath of the Lamb look like? Here's a question for you. Does the wrath of the Lamb look like war? Or does the wrath of the Lamb look like deliverance for the faithful? There is an interlude. The sequence is halted by chapter 7. And we're going to look at that next week. Because after all the monumental suffering that happens in chapter 6 at the end, the seventh seal is opened, and the seventh seal brings silence. Silence. Why? It's not what you would expect. You would expect, if God has heard the prayers of his patiently enduring faithful ones, that he would come and whisk them away and deliver them. But instead, silence. The silence requires that we listen. The silence is for God to respond. And what does God's response look like? Does it look like sweeping in and smiting heads and banging together those who've been oppressive? Or does it look like deliverance? You see, in the book of Revelation, God does not deliver Christians out of suffering. But God delivers the world by the coming of the crucified and risen one. They will look upon him whom they have pierced, says John. The silence is that moment when the church is given opportunity to see God at work in the world to deliver them. Not out of, but through the suffering. There's some questions I want you to ponder as you read through the text on these 7 seals. I want you to think about time capsules. How we use those to seal up things that are important to us that we're going to share with people who come after. And what we do when we make a time capsule. So if you view these seals as a time capsule, what thoughts and feelings are sealed up in this chapter? Do these images conjure up hope or doom? Why? The problems and struggles faced by Christians in the first century are the same. They're still here. They've not gone away. War, famine, death, persecution, disaster, they're still with us. God has not stopped them. Are there solutions to them? And if so, why have we Christians not already done it? And if not, how does the Revelation speak to war, famine, death, persecution, and disaster? Does it speak to them by saying, you're going to be whisked away? Or is the message much deeper and deliberate and even confrontational? This section of the book of Revelation affirms that verse from the old hymn, there is a wideness in God's mercy. There is no place where earth's sorrows are more felt than up in heaven. What do you think this section from the book of Revelation means? Are there any other hymns that might come to mind that you hear from the words of chapter 6? And finally, at the breaking of the seventh seal, there's silence. What's the purpose of that silence? Is it beneficial? Where does the church teach us to practice silence? Can those silent moments teach us hope? Why or why not? As I've indicated, we're going to look next time at Revelation chapter 7. So after you finish with chapter 6 and a few verses of chapter 8, go back to chapter 7, and we'll look at that interlude between the 6th and 7th seal and see what's actually happening in the text. If you have any questions, there's my email. Feel free to drop me a line. Also, if there's something that I've brought up that's spurred some other question in your head, you can write me there or bring them to class. Or if you want me to bring your questions without feeling called upon, you can send me your questions and I'll bring them to class for us. I look forward to gathering together to talk about the 7 seals.